Kia ora tātou katoa e hui mai nei tēnei ahi hai. E ti matanga ko rero māku, ko te mihi tuatahi ki te runga rawa, e te tangi anō rao, te ngāka kia tau iho rao, ona mana ki ta ngātua ki runga kia tātou katoa e pai. E pai nei runga i te kaupapa e karanga nei tātou kia hui, rā ko te Puutake o te Riri. Te Puutake o te Riri, te kaupapa mō tēnei rā. Ngari, e halapea i te kaupapa o te tahi rā. Ngari he mea kaue, mo roto i ngā rā katoa o tēnei tau, harake nei. Ono, i mihi ana kia koutou. Koutou te iwi toa i haere mai i roto i ngā karawhiu o tāwhiri mātea. No leila i mihi ana rā kia koutou. First and foremost, take the opportunity to acknowledge that creative force, that divine presence that brought into creation all things seen and unseen. And ask for that same divinity to bestow bounties and blessings upon Kirikiriroa Hamilton, ngā waihono i te pō, and for that same blessing and bounty to be extended to each and every one of you who have braved the tempest outside, the wet weather, the cold, and the wind to come today as part of the commemoration of Te Puutake o te Riri. He Raa Maumahara, the commemorations of the New Zealand Wars, the New Zealand Land Wars, and you reside here in the Waikato, the very heart, the crucible, if you like, of those colonial wars and the effects of which still resonate now. But enough from me, because you're not here to listen to me, and I'm taking the form of Sani Kārena, the kaumātua for our whare here, who unfortunately was called away at lunchtime to attend to a matter of urgency. But you have me. A poor replacement, Shane Tiruki, the Mātauranga Māori lead for our council. I take the opportunity to welcome each and every one of you. Mana whenua mai, tangata tiriti mai, nau mai haere mai, whakatau mai rā. Welcome to your museum, your Whare Taonga, and a special welcome to Rahui Papa. I think many of you will know him by his reputation, by his knowledge, and by his extensive experience within the very subject that you're here to listen about, Te Puutake o te Riri. Rahui is a wellspring of historical knowledge and is also very adept at taking that historical knowledge and turning it into something that's quite easily accessible to each and every one of us. At the same time, futurizing the past as a conversation for us going forward. O e nora e tako rangatira Rahui, tēnei kamihi atu ki a koe. Koe tā mai rā, i runga i te reo pōhiri, te tautoko te kaupapa o te rā. Nori rā, tēnei kamihi, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Hare mai.
Kia ora tātou i rato i tō tātou whare. Tautoko ake ana e te tuakana e Shane, ngā mihi ki te runga rawa, ngā mihi ki tō tātou ariki nui, kuini ngā waihono i te pō, e noho nei runga i te taumatatapu o ngana mātua, o ngana tūpuna, kia ora te kāhui ariki. Ki o tātou mate tāruru nui, kua huri kaweka nei ki a tātou haere koutou, haere whakangaroa tura. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for entertaining me today, and absolutely an auspicious occasion. And I want to acknowledge Shane for the opening remarks. I do also want to acknowledge the museum, the holder of a lot of the taonga that have come from the subjects that we'll be talking about today. So absolutely fantastic. Thank you one and all. Look, my part here is to follow along really from Dr. Vincent O'Malley when he talked about the historical aspects of Te Puutake o Te Riri. But I wanted to touch on some of the historical points that happened during some of the land wars, not all of them. They're very, very well documented anyway, and so there's a whole lot of other exponents, really, that talk about the various battles. But for my part, was mainly for here within the Tainui Waka region, in the Waikato and Maniapoto areas, and actually analysing some of the things that happened in our past and how it has translated intergenerationally to us in a modern context as lessons of our past for the pathway to our future. And so that's what I'm going to be touching on today. And thank you, one and all, for, like Shane said, braving the vicissitudes of the weather. There's a bloody storm happening outside, and the airports are closing and all of those sorts of things, but you dedicated few are absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much. So Te Puutake o Te Riri are the lessons of our past. I wanted to start off really by highlighting a bit of a timeline of how we've come to this sort of spot. And so 3 years after the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the first conflict between Māori and Pākehā took place in Waido and the top of the South Island. Te Rauparaha took umbrage at some people trying to claim some of his areas. And so there were, in my memory, there were 9 constabulary that were shot and killed, and 3 Māori died. So that was the first blood spilt, really, on this land following Te Tiriti o Waitangi. Just a couple of years later, at the cradle of the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi in the north, not far from Waitangi itself, was Ohaiawai and Ruapekapeka. 2 major battles, because 5 years after the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, a lot of the Ngāpuhi chiefs were disillusioned by really their counterparts undermining the principles that they had signed. Let's not forget that once those chiefs put their moko or their mark on Te Tiriti o Waitangi, it becomes sacrosanct to them. It was when they signed, or when they made their mark on Te Tiriti o Waitangi, it was not only a signature or a contractual obligation, it was actually their mana that they were putting on the line. And so 5 years later, people like Honeheke and Teruki Kawiti and others felt that actually what they had signed 5 years prior had been diminished. And so a few years later, one of the chiefs in Waitara in northern Taranaki called Te Teira signed away some of the tribal lands in and around Waitara. The paramount chief of the area, he negated the sale. And he said, actually, Te Teira didn't have the authority to do this. And so that contract must be null and void. The constabulary came and invaded those people to uphold the agreement that had been signed. Waikato, and in particular, Wiremu Tamihana from Ngāti Haua, a great chief from around this area actually, he travelled south with mai tupuna, with Te Oriori, to try and create peace. His brother had travelled south to involve himself in the fighting. So had some of our Maniapoto cousins. They had gone south into the Waido affair to make sure that the principles and the doctrines of Māori and the protection of their lands was being upheld. So that was 1860. Because of Tainui participation in the 1860s battle in Taranaki, the Crown then had a motive to invade the Waikato. So 3 years later, and they had to wait 3 years later, because the kingitanga had been established in 1858. And then Pōtatau Te Wherowhero was the king. He had the agreement and he had the mandate of almost all of the leading chiefs of the time. So Governor Grey had to wait until he had died. Otherwise, there was an obligation from those chiefs that established the kingitanga to come to the aid and support of the kingitanga. To fight Waikato and Maniapoto was one thing. To fight all of those chiefs would have been a whole different aspect and spectrum. So 1863, and I'm going to touch on a lot of these things. 1863 at Rangiriri and 1864 at the culmination of the wars in Ōrākau took place here in the Tainui Waka region. Tauranga Moana had come in strong support of a number of our battles until they heard that the gunboats were going into the Tauranga harbour. And so they picked up and they travelled back to Tauranga Moana for the express purposes of looking after their lands as well. And that was Gate Pā, that was Te Ranga, a couple of major battles that happened later on in 1864. By 1865, the people around the area of Te Teko had been invaded as well. And all of these battles happened because there were different, the government had come up with different ways of making a claim that Māori were being insurgent, Māori were being disloyal, and so they needed to be quelled and put down. So Te Kupenga o Taramainuku happened just on the Rangitaiki River. As you're going over the Rangitaiki River towards Whakatane, that was the battle side at Te Mapo that happened, Te Kupenga o Taramainuku. Later that same year, Vulkna passed, got killed. So Vulkna was one of the leading parish members, really, of the Rangiaowhia affair. And Māori viewed him as a spy that was giving information to the constabulary and to the armed forces. What happened at Rangiaowhia is that a couple of people, well, more than a couple of people, but two people in particular died. A woman and her child. And they were that was the wife and the child of Kirikiriroa Te Rau. And Kirikiriroa Te Rau followed Vulkna all the way back to the Ōpōtiki area and actually killed him in his church. And if you've ever seen the movie Utu, that was based on a huge part on Kirikiriroa Te Rau and the killing of the priest in the Ōpōtiki mission there. Later on, other people were blamed, other people of the Te Whakatohea tribe, and so a battle took place at Te Tarata, and thousands upon thousands of acres were confiscated as a result of that. Later on, still in that same year, Te Koti had escaped back from Wharekauri, from the Chatham Islands. And when he got back to Tūranga, or Gisborne as we know it, or just outside of Gisborne, a battle took place. Te Koti was imprisoned for no reason at all. Actually, there is no record of any conviction of Te Koti prior to him coming back. So he was incarcerated with no justification at all. And so they grabbed a schooner from the Chatham Islands and came back to the mainland. At Tūranga, at Wairengahika, a battle ensued, and so that's how the Tūranga, or the Gisborne whānau, the Tairāwhiti, got embroiled in these things as well. Everyone will know about Parihaka. Parihaka was led as a passive resistance movement in the 1860s through to the 1880s. But by 1881, and just up the road, you see the Tainui offices. They reside on Bryce Street. Well, John Bryce was the minister in charge of invading Parihaka. And so he took the soldiers at that time, he took cannons, and he took copious amounts of, the caskets of the gunpowder and things like that. So at Parihaka in 1881, John Bryce sent the troops into Parihaka. It was a passive resistance force. So there were no guns, there were no soldiers in Parihaka at that time. As a result of that, Te Whiti and Tohu were incarcerated in the South Island for passive resistance. And don't forget, this happened way before people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King. And so they were taking their examples, really, from some of the things that were happening here in Aotearoa. And so Parihaka became a huge part and parcel of the history of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And then it culminates really in 1916 with Rua Kenana and Maunga Pohatu. And Rua Kenana had established a home for himself at Maunga Pohatu called Hiru Haramahu, or the New Jerusalem. And so Rua Kenana facilitated and looked after all of the people under his care. And then in 1916, they thought, oh, this fella must be sly-gogging. So they sent the constabulary into Maunga Pohatu and shot Rua Kenana's son and Rua Kenana's mokopuna. And as a result of that, Rua Kenana was himself incarcerated and then exonerated in the courts. But the convictions stood. The convictions stood until about 2016, where the Governor-General attended at Maunga Pohatu and created squashed the convictions, but didn't go as far as to pardon Rua Kenana. So a lot of these things are still relevant to families that are living in the here and the now. So that's a bit of a snapshot of 10 of the battles. I put this up because after the Rangiaowhia event at Hairini on a hill just above Rangiaowhia is where Wiremu Tamihana, he saw the glint in the eyes of the constabulary. He saw the determination of the soldiers as they were coming through, that he said, I now know this is a battle for Aotearoa. It's not just invading Waikato. It's not just invading all of those other areas. Actually, this is a grab for the whole of Aotearoa. Wiremu Tamihana was himself a bit of a pacifist in his later years. He was baptized into the Bible and he became a lay preacher. And so he was the Mr. Peacemaker, if you like, between the kingitanga and the Pākehā of the time. When he witnessed the doings at Rangiaowhia, he had changed his mind. And so, and I'm going to touch on Rangiaowhia a little bit later on and say, Waido down south, or Haia Wairua Peka Peka in the north, Te Tarata in the west, Te Tarata in the east, Taranaki in the west, and then the Waikato right smack dab in the middle there. I just wanted to touch, before I get onto this, I just wanted to touch on how we've come to today. And it's about those battles, and it's about remembering the historical aspects and the doings of those times. I can't even remember the year now, when was, in about 2014, a group of Otorohanga students went to a visit because we were leading up to the 150 years of both Rangiaowhia and Oraka. And so I took them with the late Nick Tūwhāngai to Rangiaowhia and then to Oraka. Two separate students from Otorohanga College at that time came up. We were absolutely flabbergasted that they hadn't learnt the history that was on their doorstep, or their back doorstep, really. As Otorohanga is not too far away from these battles of Rangiaowhia and Oraka. And both of them came up with the idea about how can we make this an annual journey to learn the history of our region. And that became the Otorohanga petition. And that was Leah Bell and Waimarama Anderson who led the charge for the establishment of the petition. The petition was about creating a day that we could share the stories, a day that we could tell everybody about the historical aspects and the flow-on effects that they've had. It was about securing a dedicated day, a public holiday, if you like. The public holiday didn't come to pass, but the government at that time, in particular led by Te Rūroa Flavel, was one of the ones that created resource, and he also supported a day. Many of those battle sites sent representatives to a gathering in Auckland at that time. And together they chose the 28th of October because it was the day of the signing of He Whakaputanga. That meant the exercise of mana motuhake. But it also meant that this would become something that we could talk about. And so the 28th of October isn't just a day that was plucked out of the year. It was a day that absolutely was by design. And that was ratified. The other part was for the New Zealand government to accept and to really appreciate the battles. So we talked about Anzac Day and all of our fallen heroes that had fallen on foreign soil. But we had hardly anything about those, the blood that was spilt on the lands here in Aotearoa. I mean, in the St. John's Church at Te Wamutu, there's a memorial to the British soldiers. It took years and years and years for something to acknowledge the fall of the Māori soldiers. In Auckland, you've got Marmaduke Dixon's statue standing in Mangere. He was the forest ranger that invaded a whole lot of our areas. John Bryce and all of those sorts of guys, Volkner. And that's why it was important in Hamilton East here, there was Volkner Street. And so we had that changed. And this was all part and parcel of the courage of the Otorohanga students. And then a lot of schools packed in beside them to march the petition onto Parliament grounds that was accepted by every political party that day. None of them declined. And actually a lot of them said, if we get into power, then we will make sure that some of these things, not all of them, they couldn't agree to everything, just like politicians today, They can't agree with everything, but there were significant things that they could agree to that have come to fruition, like the day for Te Puutake o Te Riri that we are sharing now. It has been around a number of different regions commemorating those stories. But those stories, there's a whole, with the AI Google search and things like that, you can get all the information that comes from the internet. But there's still a whole lot and a number of stories that are held in the hearts and minds of the descendants, both Māori and Pākehā, of those times. And so people said, this is just another Maori thing. But actually, it was an acknowledgement of all of the blood that was spilt in Aotearoa, those that died in the wars and those that had survived in the wars. And so it was that petition, really, that changed a number of mindsets around, from the mouths of babes sort of thing. And so these two young ladies, with their friends at Otorohanga, with their friends at a number of schools, I think there was more than 1,000 school students that walked the petition up Parliament grounds and presented it. And I wanted to acknowledge the Honourable Nanaia Mahuta, who was the sponsoring principal member of Parliament that accepted the petition that day. But every political party was there, and actually they did some work. So some of the Labour Māori caucus actually went around to the offices and said, hey, there's 1,000 kids on our lawn and you're sitting in your office. Get out there and accept their petition. And so they did, and it was a really awesome day. Right, so as we move now into some of the stories. And so part and parcel of the story of the Waikato Wars is the Tairāwhiti expedition. The Tairāwhiti expedition started just north of Tikitiki in the east coast of Ruatoria and places like that, where there was a number of Kingitanga supporters that were residing there. They had heard about the imminent invasions into the Waikato, and they said, okay, cuzzies, let's get some kits of riwai and we'll make our way to Waikato to support the effort. On their way, Te Whānau Apanui joined, Ngāi Tai joined, Te Whakatohea joined, and Ngā Tiawa joined the Tairāwhiti expedition. that was coming to the aid and support of the kingitanga at Rangiriri. Unfortunately, some of our cousins from a Lakes district that I won't name, around Te Arawa, they had supported the government at that time. And so they actually put a force up to pause the Tairāwhiti expedition from moving forward. What the government did at that time is they put their gunboats out on the sea at Matata and they bombed the lot, friend and foe alike. And so there were a number of those aspects that still ring true. And that really saw the Te Arawa and Tainui making peace in the 1880s. Because they felt that they were doing their obligation to the crown that they had pledged allegiance to, only to be bombed. And a number of, not only Te Tairāwhiti, but a number of Te Arawa fell at Te Kaukauroa in Matata. So if you're standing in Matata, everyone knows where the Matata pub is on the main road. Well, it's just across the road and right by the estuary. That's where Te Kaukauroa is. And so they had their gunboats on the water, bombing the hell out of everyone, friend and foe alike. So people talk about the Tairāwhiti expedition, and one of the lessons is the value of relationships. The value of relationships that Tairāwhiti were coming through. They were coming through to support an effort that they believed in. And so we say, you know, when whakapapa combines with whakapono, when your whakapapa, your genealogy, combines with your whakapono, with your beliefs, then unity of purpose prevails. And so we will never forget the aspects that led to the deaths of many of our relations. And when our whānau from another waka decided that they would fight on the side of the colonial forces and pause the Tairāwhiti expedition, we always remember, even when your cousins stand up against you, you have to have the fortitude to carry on. So that's something that we've experienced time and time again. And so, and now I come to around about 1863. The establishment of the kingitanga happened in around 1858. But they had to wait for Te Whero to die so that he wouldn't call on the obligation of those that had established the kingitanga. Governor Grey, though, on his tour of duty in the 1860s, prior to that, he was a great friend of the Māori king. So much so that in the 1840s, he asked Pōtatau to come to Auckland with his Waikato Maniapoto people to become the protectorates of the fledgling city that is Auckland. They had heard that other whānau from the north and from the east were coming to invade Auckland, to purge Auckland of this disease that was Pākehā. And so Pōtatau and his whānau went to live in Auckland. They initially started at Mangere, but then they carried on to where the Auckland Museum is situated now. And that's where he said his famous saying, staving off the attacks of his relations. And he said, kia tūpato ki te takahi I te remu o taku kākau. Be careful not to trample on the hem of my cloak. Otherwise, he was saying, I belong here. You walk on my cloak, you are taking me on. You're not taking on just the Pākehā, you're taking me on. It had soured, though. Within the 1850s and the establishment of the colonial government, they were creating laws that were alienating Māori from their lands. So again, Wiremu Tamihana went to see the governor. And he tried to get an audience with the governor, and for 2 days he had to sit outside his office. And the official at that time, because these people were men of mana, and they viewed the governor as a man of mana as well. But the official at that time bent over and he said, if you call through my legs, I'll let you see the governor. Well, that was a step too far for people with mana. And so he left and he took up the plight, really, of the establishment of the kingitanga. 5 years later, in 1863, Governor Grey used Māori insurgents as disloyalty to the British Crown. That was never the case. That was never the case. The establishment of the kingitanga was supposed to be Potatau and his people as the rafters on one side of the house, Queen Victoria and her people as the rafters on the other side of the house, and God Almighty would be the ridgepole that combines them together. That was the rhetoric of the time. Governor Grey, though, had a bit of a better propaganda machine. And so he said to everybody, oh, I'm worried now about these Waikato people. They're going to come up and they're going to eat you because they're disloyal to the crown. And so he made a proclamation in 1863, and he said to the whānau living in Auckland, if you don't pledge allegiance to Queen Victoria and give up your guns, get out south of the Mangatawhiri River. And so a lot of them did, but there was a number of our whānau that stayed. So it was hedging our bets, really. So some of our chiefs, they stayed with some of their whānau on their traditional lands. Some of our chiefs came south to support the kingitanga. And it wasn't about that they were in conflict with each other. It was about $1 each way on the outcome of the war. Yeah. Unfortunately, those that stayed, it's promised in the declaration that they would be protected. They were the first to be confiscated. Their lands were the first to be confiscated. And now, today in Auckland, you'll see 2% of the Māori estate that was enjoyed in the 1860s, that's all that remains. 98% of the lands, both gifted and confiscated, are now within the government machine, and now, dare I say it, within the council machine. And so councils, we've had a love-hate relationship for generations. And it was because of these scurrilous deeds by these guys. Actually, they made it up. Governor Grey, I'll carry on with that in just a little while. And so when some of our people stayed and tried to protect their lands in Auckland, and some of our people came south, it was strategic. It was hedging our bets. It was in a plight to cover all of our bases. When the battles were all, when the war, because there wasn't any war at that time, but if it did, they would still have a home because their whānau promised that they would be protected by the proclamation of Governor Grey. And that's what, ki te kore e wati, if you don't make an oath of allegiance, me whakawātea, get out. Get out of Auckland. And so that was the nub, really, of the whole of the proclamation there from Governor Grey in 1863. And then there were some battles, or some skirmishes, really, in Pukekohe and Meremere. They weren't really full-on battles, but there were some skirmishes where people actually, the ill-fated ones, actually died. And so in Pukekohe, at the Pukekohe East Church, there were shots fired and some of the Māori died there. At Meremere, it was a holding pattern while Māori were building their pā at Rangiriri. But in that, we were reminded that because of Governor Grey's proclamation and because of the times that were happening around there, he needed financial resources. And so, two of the colonial government stepped down out of the colonial government and established the Bank of New Zealand. The Bank of New Zealand was designed to finance the invasion of the Waikato. Now, Waikato Tainui, we have a pretty good relationship with the Bank of New Zealand. Hey, we do business together. We will never forget our historical past, but our historical enemies don't necessarily mean that they are forever enemies. Hey? That we can actually overcome some of those aspects there. The creation of the Great South Road. All of you that have been to Auckland go up the main highway, the double-lane highway now. Well, just on the side of it was the original State Highway number 1 that was called the Great South Road. That was built so troops could come off the boats on the Waitemata and have a roadway down to Mangatawhiri to invade the Waikato. So 2 major points was the BNZ and the Great South Road. They were designed to invade the Waikato because that was Grey's plan all along. That was Grey's plan all along. We have to invade the Waikato because the Waikato and the Kingitanga were saying, we're not going to sell you any more land. And he had all of these people, all of these settlers coming over from the different parts of the Commonwealth, not just from England, and not just from the UK. They were coming from South Africa. They were coming from India. They were coming from other parts of the British colonial world, and they wanted to make their home in New Zealand. And he was saying, come, and we'll give you a home. We'll give you some land. Unfortunately, he was running out of land to fulfill his promise. And so he had to design a way to invade the Waikato. Because they were the strongest voices saying, we're not going to sell any more land. We are going to protect our estate come hell or high water. 1863, Governor Grey sends his troops across the Mangatawhiri in the initial invasion of the Waikato. And then later on in November of that year, the Rangiriri battle happened. As you drive up the main road, you'll see the the new main road. Used to be, they cut the road in half and you had to drive right through the pass side. That was how State Highway 1 used to be. Now with the new road, we insisted that the New Zealand Transport Agency fill that bloody thing in. Because when they cut the road through these pa, it was to break the back of the pa so that Māori wouldn't come back and re-inhabit those spaces and thereby wouldn't start up the flickers of war again. And so Rangiriri ensued. Rangiriri taught us to be resilient. We had heard from the northern battles and from the Te Rāwhiti expedition that actually our Pākehā counterparts had this brand new technology to New Zealand, and they were called gunboats on the Waikato River. We had never seen them before. So much so that they tried to fell trees into the river to stop them from coming up the river, but the gunboats were far too technological for that to be a hindrance to them. So they parked outside Rangiriri. One of them was the Pioneer. And so if you are driving and you see the road to Mangatawhiri, actually that's called Pioneer Ave. That's named after that gunboat. The Miranda parked up in the Hauraki Gulf. That's why Miranda gets its name. It's because of these gunboats, because of the technology that they could bring. And so they started bombing the hell out of Rangiriri. So they advanced by land, but they also advanced by river. I'm going to tell you a couple of homegrown stories about my tupuna, Te Oriori. Te Oriori was one of the leaders in the pā, but you also had others who had designed the pā with trenches. And the reason why they did that was because they heard about the cannon fire, and the trenches absorbed the cannonballs, so that it wouldn't have so big of an impact on the inhabitants of the pā. One of the stories, and we chuckle about it as a whānau now. Well, we sort of chuckle about it, but on one of the nights of Rangiriri, there was a hell of a rainstorm that come down, and it made the gunpowder within the pā all wet, and so they couldn't load and reload their muskets and things like that. So Te Oriori encouraged them to put up the white flag, but his intention was to ask the Pākehā, give us some of your gunpowder so we can carry on fighting. Yeah, people say that's naive and all of that, but, and so when they put up the white flag, all of the army and the soldiers come flooding into the pa, thinking that they had won the day. And all these Maoris were looking at them going, we just want your gunpowder so we can carry on fighting. And that was one of the things. In the battles, though, our Pākehā colonel was shot on the field. And he was in a spot where not only would he be fired upon from those in the pa, but his own mates as well. So Te Uriuri shot out and dragged him into a hollow, but he got shot twice in the foot. And when they asked him after the battle, how come you did that? And he said, I wanted to be known as a person that will save a man's life. That man was Captain Mercer. And so the township of Mercer was named, unfortunately he didn't survive, but the township of Mercer was as a direct result of the Rangiriri battle there. So, what has Rangiriri taught us? Rangiriri has taught us that we've got to be resilient, that we've got to be adaptable, and that we've got to pivot. Okay. So prior, they would face off in battle with each other. This was one of the first times that the trenches were employed by Māori. It was so well documented that actually this became an example to the British soldiers in World War I, where they had created trenches in World War I. I mean, probably not just Rangiriri, but it was absolutely documented by the leading soldiers of the time that actually this was quite a, had a huge effect, and the impacts were minimised when you did stuff like this. And so that became part and parcel of the war teachings for the British from then on. And so today, the lessons that were fought here in Aotearoa are still being employed by, now you've got drones and all of that sort of stuff, but in World War I, with the cannon fire and the trenches absorbing the impacts of the cannonballs, that was some of the things that we were taught and that we actually used as a lesson. This place is called Pāterangi. And if you've ever driven from Pirongia or down the Te Awamutu road into Te Awamutu, you're driving right through Pāterangi. And the Pāterangi school is still right there. They had learnt from Rangiriri, so they abandoned Ngārua Wāhia, too close to the river. So they built Pāterangi because there was enough of away from the rivers for the gunboats to be ineffective. They had to come over land. And there were four main towers, or four main pa, that were all joined in a big long line called the Pāterangi line. It was impregnable. They couldn't use their cannons. Their muskets were being ineffective as well. And so General Cameron abandoned the invasion of Pāterangi. And he said, oh no, this is too bloody hard. And so this is too bloody hard, so we need to find another way. I want to touch on the next part in the same way. This is an image, a historical image of Rangiaowhia. Prior to the Battle of Pāterangi, the churches at that time advocated with the hierarchy of the British soldiers that Rangiaowhia would be a refuge. It would be a place where no one would invade. That the elderly, the women and the children would be safe. When Pāterangi, though, was impregnable, they decided that the forest rangers would skirt around and invade Rangiaowhia, thereby violating the agreement with Bishop Selwyn at the time. He had promised and he had negotiated, and they had agreed with the hierarchy of the soldiers at that time. So much so that elderly were shot, children were killed. And the story, the main story, is that there were two churches at Rangiaowhia. Rangiaowhia was the breadbasket of the whole of the Waikato and Maniapoto people. There were orchards, there were wheat fields, they used to have wheat mills that would create their own bags of wheat. Some of them were sent to Queen Victoria as a present in London. A lot of them were exported to Auckland and then exported into the Americas and into Australia. They had flax, and so they were making ropes, and they were making all of those things. It was a very industrious place, Rangiaowhia. Then when the hard times came with the wars, Rangiaowhia was deemed as the refuge, as the place of safe haven for all of those that couldn't fight. And so with the invasion of Rangiaowhia, there were two churches, a Catholic church and a Protestant church. They said to the people that were, go into the church and you'll be safe. So a lot of them went into the church. Unfortunately, they burnt the Catholic church to the ground. So much so that the inhabitants within were trying to kick holes in the wall because they were outside guarding it. And so they were unable to kick a hole just big enough to fit small children through. The adults all perished that went into that church, but there were a significant number of children that they pushed through the hole, sent down to the swamp to hide. One of those little children, a little girl, made her way back through Otorohanga, and in the middle of Otorohanga in Te Kuiti, told her whānau what had happened. They changed her name to Te Mamai, the grief, the pain, as a token of a memory of what happened at Rangiaowhia. From then on, the mistrust between Māori and the hierarchy of the British soldiers was just immense. There was no more trust. And so one of the learnings here is that you can't always trust your enemies. When they make agreements and then they violate them, you have to be able to stand up and you have to be able to move forward. That was one of the biggest tragedies because there were no guns that were found in Rangiaowhia. After the battles, no guns were found in Rangiaowhia. But there were dead people. There were dead people in Rangiaowhia. That had a huge impact that the people of the men that were fighting in Pāterangi all filed out of there and sat on the Haerini Hill. And then another little battle ensued. That's when Were Mutamihana said, I now know this is a battle for all of Aotearoa. And I'm not saying this to be all doomy and gloomy, because there was some pretty cool stuff happening at the time as well. But after Rangiaowhia, not long after, we had the Battle of Orako. Orako is a place that is on the Arapuni Road from Te Wamutu, from Kihikihi through to the Arapuni Dam. Just up from there, just outside of Kihikihi is Orako. Riri Maniapoto led the charge there, and others had come to support, like the Tūhoe had brought over Te Rau Takitahi, a number of Tūhoe fighters to take part in Orako. A number of Te Arawa had come, and especially Hinei Tūrama and others of Tauranga Moana, of Ngāti Kahungunu. They had all come because they had heard about the battles in the Waikato and they wanted to support Riri Maniapoto. Riri Maniapoto was a strategist. So Orako wasn't supposed to be the site of the battle. It was supposed to be a holding site where they would fire some shots whilst they were building an impregnable pa to draw the soldiers in for the big battle. But Tūhoe had said, our cannons are too heavy for us to come and sit and do nothing. And so Riri had to acquiesce. He had to agree, even though Orako wasn't fully prepared at that time. It was too far away from the water source. There were other aspects that you wouldn't naturally find the fighting part. But Riri had to do it. And so I don't know, some of the people of Shane's age ilk will remember Rewi's Last Stand, that movie back in the day. And so that was Rewi Maniapoto. And the mistrust between the people that inhabited Ōrākau and the soldiers was hugely high. And so the soldiers said, send out your women and your children and we'll ensure their safety. O lahu mai te pairata from Ngāti Tū Whare Toa and Ngāti Raukawa. She stood up and said, if the men are to die, then so will the women and children. And Rangiriri, they had shot the kids in the Kopuera Lake. And even when the double-lane highway was being built, baby bones were still being found in the Kopuera Lake. Rangi Aowhia, a significant number of children had perished there, and they weren't prepared to make that faithful exchange again. And so that was Ōrākau, but one of the things about Ōrākau was they were heavily outnumbered. The technology that the Pākehā had at that time way surpassed that, so they were fighting sometimes with peach pips as their bullets. But they were making do. And so one of the major things was Rewi led the charge for the people to break out of Ōrākau, cross the river at Pūniu, and then into the King Country. And so that's where that was. So, when you talk about Rewi's famous saying, and you'll hear it in just about every picket and every protest that happens now, ka whawhai tonu mātou, ake, ake, ake. We will fight on forever and ever and ever. In my view, Rewi wasn't just talking about the battles of the 1860s. He could foresee that there was going to be, in every generation, a different battle to wage. Now, the foreshore and seabed legislation is being passed, we fight again. Now, the Treaty Principles Bill, we fight again. That was a vision that Rewi had put out there in the 1860s. When he said it, and because he was a man of immense mana, it created a responsibility and an obligation of the various generations following him not to sit down and take adversity as something that we could accept. We're not going to just agree to be mediocre for the sake of being mediocre. We need to be excellent. And that's what ka whawhai tonu mātou, ake, ake, ake means. I mean, it doesn't mean that we're going to pick up a gun and shoot at each other. Today, our generals are our lawyers. Today, our masses walk down the road and protest about a number of different things. All of those things come from the obligation to Rewi about not sitting and being complacent in the context of our time. And we remember the two Hoi people coming to support at Ōrākau, Te Rautakita. They weren't going to come at first. They thought, actually, we'll just look after our own patch and let Rewi and them do their own thing. But in the process of time, they decided, actually, we want to go and we want to engage in these sorts of things. If we stop it there, then it won't come to our region. And so, two Hoi came. Very, very few returned to their people. And within the two Hoi people, they have a manawa wera that says, hea koe te whenua nui hoki mai ai. And so why did you come home? Why didn't you die with our husbands that lie in the lands of another tribe? And so the memory of the two Hoi participation in Ōrākau can never be forgotten. We will never forget those who came to our aid, those that came to support the cause, those that came to live and to die alongside our people. Even with the heavy toll that it took on their people, so we have our whakapapa connections, our genealogical connections, but o rākau is also a whakapapa connection between the kingitanga, the Tainui people, and our people of Tūhoe. And so, later on that year, Tauranga Moana was invaded. Gate Pā, well, actually, it was one of the more successful battles. Rua Peka Peka and Gate Pā were two recorded as Māori victories in their time. They had created a mound, like the trenches that would absorb the fire, but with the holes and the thing, and they would fight. But what the Tauranga chiefs did was they said, let's not shoot at them. Wait till they get closer. And so they found, oh, shivers, these fellas must have abandoned this part. So they all come rushing in, all got shot. Hey, bro. One of the people that got shot was a guy called Captain Hamilton. He had come from Auckland directly to Tauranga. So Hamilton is named after him, but he never stepped foot in the Waikato. Ludicrous, eh? Ludicrous. So Gate Pā, or Puke Hina Hina, was one of the more successful battle strategies in that time. And then the Battle of Te Ranga that happened just a few weeks later resulted in the European victory in battle. But why I wanted to talk about that is because this gives rise to the mentality of our people at that time. One of the great people over there, Rahui, he had made a comment from the Bible, albeit, that he said, ki te hia inu tō hoariri, whainutia. Ki te hia kai tō hoariri, whāngaihia. If your enemy is thirsty, give them water. And if your enemy is hungry, give them food. That was the way, the chivalrous way that we entered into battle. You know, notwithstanding the scurrilous effects of the violations of some of our agreements, this was still some of the mentalities of the chiefs of those battles in those times. They were very, very respectful to the people and the places of that time. And so, one of the lessons is that we never ever, even in the face of the most adverse things that are happening to us, we don't have to lose the high ground. We don't have to be un-Māori. We don't have to abandon our tikanga, our principles, just because we're in a bun fight. We can respect the right to challenge. We can respect the right to be friends. But we must do it under the purposes of the tikanga, of the protocols and practices that we have in our DNA. Parihaka, as we talked a little bit about before, in Parihaka with John Bryce sending his troops with their cannons sitting above a hill. And actually, they did try to bomb the peaceful settlements of Parihaka. Parihaka, or Te Whiti and Tohu, had led all of their females to do the poi, because the poi is a very traditionally spiritual aspect of the way that Taranaki provide their karakia, their prayers and incantations. And so there were lines and lines of women with these cannons faced towards them. Tohu Kākai, one of the chiefs at that time, he went to sleep and he had a dream about this dog roaming around the Pākehā cannons and actually urinating on their casks of gunpowder. The next day, Gorst ordered the cannons to fire, and they wouldn't fire. It's the power of belief. The power of belief. The power of passive resistance. The power of unity of purpose. And so what happened? He sent his troops down with bayonets to finish the job. He couldn't kill them all. But his cannons wouldn't fire. And that was a sign to Tohu and Te Whiti hey, it doesn't matter what happened, we've got the divine on our side. And so, you know, people say, well, no, it's just silly, but people say the power of whakapono, the power of belief, and the power of passive resistance. We didn't have to be passive. We could have stood up like Titoko Waru, one of their cousins, and fought and fought and fought. But actually, there, kaupapa, when the surveyors come to survey their land, they took out the pigs, and they hit them in the pocket, rather than shooting guns and things like that at them. These are some of the lessons from Parihaka that have been reverberated worldwide. Now we talk about people like Gandhi, people like Martin Luther King, people like Nelson Mandela. They had nothing on these jokers. They had nothing on the history of our people here in Aotearoa. I mean, I say our people, it's people from Aotearoa, because you won't find, in all of those battles that I mentioned, you won't find anyone that has not one single drop of Pākehā blood. We are so intermingled, we are so intermarried, we are so interrelational that we descend from both sides of the conflict now. And those times would have been a bit different. But today, we are pretty much on both sides. And so, what then was the Kingitanga response? Following the Battle of Ōrākau, Tāwhiao went into exile. And so that's King Tāwhiao, the second Māori king there in the photo. He put his hat on a map and drew a circle around it and created what we now call the King Country, the King's Country, or Te Whare Taonga, the area of the hat. The area of the hat was so sacrosanct that they had an agreement that actually no one could come into that area without the express permission of the rangatiras that lived in that area. And that extended through Kawhia, that extended to Taumaru Nui, that extended to parts of Taupo. That was the king country of those times. Later on, it was opened up. But it became, my words, a sovereign nation within a sovereign nation. And people said, oh, no, you can't say that because, it's never happened before. And I turned to the Shahs of the Indian nations that actually had sovereign nations within the nation of India. There was nothing different about this. They created their own laws. They made sure that there was no need for oranga tamariki. There was no child protection services within the Rohe Pote in their time. Actually, there were some people that were allowed in there, and they talked about the children were healthy. The children were being educated. Not so much educated in the school system that we know, but they were being taught to fish, they were being taught to hunt, they were being taught to be self-reliant. And so that was the education within the Rohe Pote at that time. But they would also sing songs about what had happened to them, what had happened to the wider tribal groupings that had come there. By the 1880s, there was a shift. And so the King Country was opened up principally because of the railway. They wanted the railway to go from Auckland to Wellington, and they had to go through the King Country. But they couldn't. So they made some of these cockamamie agreements that were violated again and again and again. But that was in the for the purposes of the industry in New Zealand. It was for the greater good of all of Aotearoa. Well, Cherubro did that one. So the principles of the Kingitanga, right at the very beginning, puru i te toto, to cease the intertribal warfare, to stem the flow of blood. Pupuru i te whenua, to hold fast to the land. The confiscations, 1.2 million acres in 1865 by the swish of a pen. From Miranda in a straight line to Karapiro, across the northern face, around Maunga Tautari to Ōrākau, up to the peak of Pirongia, down to the northern side of Raglan, back up to Auckland, and across to Miranda. 1.2 million acres was confiscated. Why? Because Grey wanted he wanted control of the bread basket. He wanted control of the supply lines of the kingitanga to feed Auckland in that time. It was his sole purpose. But the confiscation of land wasn't just about the taking of land. It was those lands that our ancestors were buried. It was those lands that provided the sustenance for family units, for hapu units, for iwi units. It was those lands and those waters that we fished, that we hunted for the self-sustainability of us as a people. So the confiscation of those lands wasn't just about confiscation of land, it was actually the psychological damage that it did to the people of that time. And that psychological damage has had a ripple effect that has been augmented by the creation of various pieces of legislation, like the what's that act? The Tohunga Suppression Act. That stopped us from practicing our traditional ways of healing by incarceration. No, I'm not going to. I mean, it didn't actually wipe it out, but there was so much of an impact of those pieces of legislation that actually some of those activities stopped in their tracks. Pupuru I te mana Māori motuhake. Mana Māori motuhake, people say, oh, that's authority, or that's prestige, or that's all, and it means all of those things. Hey. Mana cannot be defined in Pākehā terms. Right? Because the depth of concept goes way beyond authority, self-determination, all of those sorts of aspects. Mana Māori motuhake is the preservation of our way of life, in the way that we want to preserve it. When Kingi Tuheitia said in 2024, just be Māori all day, every day, he was talking about mana Māori motuhake. Live your life in the way that you want to live it. That was a catchphrase from the 1850s that has been rehearsed and rehearsed and repeated right through to the current generation. So these are some of the lessons of our past, our collective past, our collective Aotearoa past. And so we look at relationships. Relationships are key. We're not bombastic enough to think that we're going to do this all by ourselves. No. King Tawhiao, he said, my friends will come from the four corners of the globe. Dame Tiata, she said in one of her speeches, those that are not of us but are with us will help us determine our future. So relationships will be key. Something that we've learnt from the battles of our past into the pathway of our future. Authority. We must do things the way that we want to do them, the way that we think will be sustainable for our tamariki and our mokopuna. That was what they were trying to do in those battles. That's what we're still trying to do in a today context. We don't have to be compliant with everything. Sometimes it's better to apologise than ask permission. When they say, you can't do this and you can't do that and you can't do that, sometimes when you do it, it ruffles a few feathers, but then it becomes the norm. Right? Then it becomes the norm. And so when they didn't comply with getting out of Auckland, they had real strategies about why they did that. Geographics. We must protect our patch. We must protect our boundaries. We must remember our maunga and our awa that are part and parcel of our DNA. They're not just geographical features to us. They are actually ancestors that we believe provide us sustenance. For us, within Ngāti Koro ki Kahukura, maunga tautari provided us with birds, provided us with plant life for the building of our houses. So Maunga Tautari was an ancestor that looked after his mokopuna. And Waikato wasn't just a waterway. Waikato made the lands fertile. Waikato provided the eels. Waikato provided the fish. Waikato provided the sustenance for the people living beside her. And so we say we have to look after our patch, and we can never forsake. So we would never allow anyone to desecrate our grandmothers and our grandfathers, just like our maunga and our awa. But we need to do this with aroha, with compassion. But aroha doesn't translate to being trampled upon. Humility doesn't translate to be trampled upon. No. You can be humble all you like. No. But as soon as someone starts to take advantage, that's when the tough aroha has to come into play. No. The treatment of others. Just like we learned from our tauranga moana whānau, even in the face of adversity, if your enemy is thirsty, give them a drink. If your enemy is hungry, give them some food. We don't have to forsake the way that we treat people just because others are doing it to us. Identity. That was part and parcel of the battles of those times. Identity was the protection of their identity, was the protection of their whakapapa, was the protection of their whakapono, of their beliefs. It was the protection of their tikanga, of their protocols and procedures. It was the protection of their way of life. That's identity. And then, of course, we have to resist. To sit there and do nothing in the face of adversity means that you are to blame as well. There's a huge saying from Āpirahama Tainui in the north that says, if you see something wrong and you don't correct it, you are part of that wrong. And so we have to resist. We have to maintain the right to challenge, just like our ancestors did in those times. But that right to challenge doesn't have to be all-consuming. It doesn't have to be all-consuming. And so, with our ancestry, they're couples with identity. The way that we play is in a rangatira way. We have to be rangatira. We have to be products of our past. There's no two ways about that. We have to be products, or we have to be examples for our future, for our tamariki and for our mokopuna. Just like our ancestors were in the 1850s and 1860s. Just like there have been decade upon decade upon decade, century upon century. We have to be the example for those that are coming after us. And so these are some of the lessons of our past. These are some of the lessons, not only of the adverse nature, of the fighting nature, but actually the way that we want to live, the way that we want to progress into the future, the way that we can collectively come together in a rangatira way. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. I'm going to think there. I usually go until the first one starts yawning and goes to sleep, and so I see a couple up the back doing that. Me whakatapoto aku kōrero I kone. And just to thank you for participating in today. Today marks the beacon, well, it marks the purposes of our past as a beacon for our future. Ko taku muri, taku mua. My past determines my future. Tēnā koutou, kia ora tātou katoa.